Welcome to Pathology Central Key Concepts. The topic of this video is health disparities. And I'm sure you all know by now, health disparities is a topic that is very important to me and a topic upon which I have lectured across the country with my colleague, Dr. Joseph Graves Jr. And I say that to let you know that there are abundant resources about race-based medicine. The focus of this video will be to support and accompany the new section on health disparities in Robbins Kumar Basic Pathology 11th edition. In this video, I'll be focusing on health disparities based on socially defined race. The reason for this is in part because I have an evolutionary biology background, which gives me some insight, but also because socially defined race is frequently conflated with biological contribution. So it is frequently thought that there are biological differences between the socially defined races, and I hope to dismantle some of that thought process in this video. So with that in mind, I will be comparing and contrasting the concepts of biological and socially defined race and discussing the causes of disparities between socially defined races. So health disparities are simply the differences in incidence, prevalence, severity of disease between populations. And those populations can be based on a variety of different factors, so socially defined race, gender, sexual orientation, social class, immigration status, language, etc. There really is no end to the different types of populations that can have health disparities. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about terms, and these are the terms that we discuss in Robbins and Kumar Basic Pathology. So I know that all of you are familiar with the term Caucasian. It is a pseudoscientific term that originated in the 18th century at the same time as other terms such as Mongolian to refer to Asians and Ethiopian to refer to Africans. And I would encourage you to eliminate the term Caucasian from your discourse. Another way that we can define populations is based on skin pigmentation. So we can use white or black, for example. And white, black, and brown are fairly common in the popular media. Again, I would encourage you to remove this from your vocabulary in scientific situations, because when we use white and black, that really sets up a binary comparison and does not bring in the vast numbers of other individuals in the world. Because if we're going with white and black, then we have to go with brown, yellow, and red. And we all know that that's not appropriate. So having this binary, I think, is challenging. Furthermore, as you are all well aware, there is significant variation in the range of skin pigmentation in any of these groups. So it is also just an inaccurate term. So the two terms that we do think are appropriate are related to ancestry and socially defined race. So by ancestry, we'll use terms like European descent or African descent. And we use this primarily with the concept of single gene diseases. So cystic fibrosis is more common in individuals of Northern European descent. Sickle cell disease is more common in individuals of African descent. But again, there's a problem with this, which is, first of all, it's not just Africans who are at risk for sickle cell disease. We can see this in Southern Europeans as well as Middle Easterners and some populations in India. But also because of population admixture, this term looking at descent is not particularly useful. And I would also just highlight the fact that these single gene diseases are very rare when you look at the wide spectrum of human disease. So the other set of terms that we use relate to socially defined race. Now, I think everyone is familiar with the term African American, so we expand that to use the term European American, Asian American. And I think people are familiar with all of these. This European American one is a bit discordant. It is not widely used, but it fits in through parallel structure. We're talking about continent of origin, so European American is appropriate. And for many people, this term just slots into what used to be called white or Caucasian. And when we look at socially defined race, we're going to make an association with complex diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, and cancer. These are by far the most common contribution to human disease, these complex diseases, and they are due to an interaction of the genes and the environment. And for this, environment has a very, very strong effect. Genes have a somewhat smaller effect, and it tends to be multiple genes that are involved. There are a number of diseases that are associated with susceptibility to certain alleles. Very frequently we'll refer to HLA alleles. And again, this can be somewhat complicated because there will be an association between HLA types and certain ancestries, and again, this complicates the matter. So I also want to take a little bit of time to talk about ethnicity. So ethnicity can refer to a variety of different categories. It can be country of origin or language, religion. In the United States, we primarily dichotomize ethnicity as Hispanic and non-Hispanic, where Hispanic refers to populations that speak Spanish. Now, what we typically mean in the United States when we refer to Hispanics is individuals from Latin America who are living in the United States. But since Hispanic refers to populations that speak Spanish, there are a number of Latin American countries, such as Brazil, Guyana, and Suriname, that do not have Spanish as their primary language. And also, if we use the term Hispanic, that is going to include populations like the European Spaniards, which is typically not in the same experience as what we see for Latin Americans in the United States. Another possibility then is to use a variety of terms for individuals from Latin America. In Robbins Basic Pathology, I tried to use the language of Latin Americans in the United States because that is gender neutral. When we start using terms like Latino and Latina, these are gendered terms. Latine is non-gendered. And Latinx is being used. However, there are large numbers of individuals who identify as Latin American who do not use this term. So just a caveat about that. So with that introduction, let's talk about what is race. Now, I always use the term socially defined race when I refer to race, but I don't here because here I'm talking about actual biological race, because biological races do exist, just not in modern humans. So in modern biology, we define races by two criteria: the amount of genetic variation within and between groups, and phylogenetic evidence of a unique lineage. And we can see races in a variety of animal species. But in modern humans, we know that humans show more variability within so-called races than between them. Okay, so, and because of population admixture, there is no evolutionarily distinct unique lineage. Now, that being said, we do have quite clearly geographically based genetic and physical differences, but we share 99.9% of our DNA. So biological race does not exist in modern humans, but as you all know, socially constructed or socially defined race does. And these are constructed using aspects of appearance or geography, culture, language, etc., in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. So it is not some sort of biological truth that there are distinct groups. This is something that has been created for a social dominance hierarchy, and this really began in periods of colonialism and enslavement. So that being said, that that biological race does not exist, but we do have socially defined race. Let's put this in the context of how we should be thinking about this. And this comes from an epidemiologic text, okay, highlighting race is a socially constructed variable based on the idea that some human populations are distinct from others according to external physical characteristics or places of origin. And here's the important part for all of you future healthcare workers: racial or ethnic variations in health-related states or events are explained primarily by exposure or vulnerability to behavioral, psychosocial, material, or environmental risk factors and resources, not biological. So let's take a look at how race shows up in America. So here is an example from the US Census Bureau with their definitions of these 5 races. Now, you may have read in some scientific literature about how there really are 5 races. I want you to be aware of the fact that the number of so-called races has varied historically from 2 to 63. So there is no consensus on this because you can't talk about these specific populations when the populations themselves are not specific, when there is no genotype-phenotype correlation. So let's look at this category of white, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. And just one point is that this definition has changed over time, and it varies by country. Here, the question we would ask is, well, how much origin? Because if you have a white person who has a child with a black person, where the person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa, how do you define that person? The other issue to keep in mind, and this is going to come up again and again, is there's more genetic variability in Africa than the rest of the world. So if you look at an African American whose ancestry is from Western Africa and someone from Eastern Africa, you cannot think that they have substantial genetic overlap because there is so much genetic variability in Africa. Now, if we look at American Indian or Alaskan Native, this brings in a cultural criterion where not only do you have to have an origin in the original peoples of North, South, and Central America, but you also have to maintain tribal affiliation or community attachment. So you may be a Navajo on Monday, decide you want to leave the tribe on Tuesday, and by Wednesday you're no longer an American Indian and you have to find one of these other places to be. If you look at Asian, this is a huge expanse geographically, and as I'll mention more in a bit, with increasing geographic distance, we have increasing genetic variability. And one way that to envision this is that when you look at genome-wide association screening papers and they say, oh, we looked at, Asians and we looked at Africans and there are all these differences, see, they're different races. If instead of looking at a group of Asians and a group of Africans, if you were to start in Tokyo and go every 50 miles and pick an individual and look at their genome, all the way from Tokyo to Addis Ababa, you would find that it's continuous. It's not discrete. It only looks discrete because we're looking at such large geographic distances. So here it's just, the question is, really? I mean, that's a huge geographic expanse. And then with Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, again, we get into, well, how much? At what point are you this and not one of these others? So biological race does not exist. So why are there racial disparities in health and disease? Because we know there are. I'll show you some of that later. So I'm going to digress briefly into some evolutionary biology because it's important for you to understand this, for you to understand that what you see with your eyes is not everything that is there. So the source of all biological variation is mutation. But the mutation rate is too low to cause any appreciable change in allele frequencies in eukaryotic organisms. So individuals with cells with nuclei, you and me, So bacteria can mutate so quickly that they can diverge into populations. We don't see that in eukaryotes. So what causes change in allele frequencies is going to be natural selection. So that's going to be differential reproductive success of favored genotypes. So lots and lots of examples of this in the animal kingdom. Easy example is peacocks with that beautiful massive tail that is irresistible to peahens. So we have this selective pressure for a large, beautiful tail. We also have genetic drift, which is going to be the random fluctuation of allele frequencies due to chance events, such as population bottlenecks, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And then 2 more points I want to make, which I've already alluded to multiple times. Genetic variation increases with geographic distance, and Africa has the greatest genetic diversity in the world because that is where humans originated. That is where there's been the longest amount of time for mutations to develop. So when we think about the causes of health disparities, we are thinking about, for example, the intrinsic or genetic causes, and I'm going to go through each of these individually. So we can have a selective advantage, and this is going to be most likely related to some sort of historical or ancestral pathogen. But pathogens tend to be restricted by geography, so it will be populations of a particular geographic ancestry. We can see founder effects or population bottlenecks, and I'll go through that in detail. But this is going to be populations and not races. Remember, race is this gigantic rubric, and there's so many different individuals that fall into that. We have to look at specific populations, and it's important as healthcare professionals that we do this. And we have endogamy, which is going to be marriage within, or more specifically, breeding within one's particular group based on religion, caste, geography, etc. But again, these are populations and they are not races. So let's go through each of these to provide some clarity. This is looking at selective advantage. So this is a map showing the distribution of a variety of hemoglobinopathies. And as you all know, hemoglobinopathies provide in the heterozygote state protection against malaria. So we're going to see an increased prevalence of these hemoglobinopathies in areas where there's pressure from malaria. Now, as you look at this, you can see in green, these are the thalassemias. So we have alpha and beta thalassemia. We have hemoglobin S, or sickle cell disease. One thing you can appreciate immediately is that these areas are not restricted by any particular geopolitical boundary. So we have thalassemia in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe, and in Africa. And we have sickle cell, which is typically a disease that in the United States we associate with African descent. Well, yes, it is present in Africa, but we also see it in Southern Europe, parts of the Middle East, and areas in India. So it's critical that we are aware of the fact that it's not based on any particular country or continent. And I think what really brings this home for me is that here you can see this area in Africa where there are no hemoglobinopathies. And you may wonder what super race of human lives in this area that they don't need protection from malaria. Well, it's actually quite the opposite. This is where the Sahara Desert is. So there's no water, there's no mosquitoes, no malaria, no hemoglobinopathies. So you can see that here. Now, I want to make a couple more points using this map. One is that while this may be the historical distribution of, say, for example, the thalassemias, because of globalization and migration of peoples, you can get any of these on any continent, on any country, and you can see it in any type of ancestry. And that is a critical fact for you as future health professionals, to be aware of the fact that anybody can have anything and you don't want to overlook something. And the other point to make is that the other reason why we can see these diseases everywhere is because of population admixture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But first, let's go to our next item, which was founder effect and population bottleneck. So here you can see this is a population, a happy, healthy population. Each of these colors represents an allele. So we have yellow, red, and blue alleles. Most of the people here have yellow or blue alleles. We have a few red scattered here. And if we have a catastrophic event, perhaps, that eliminates most of the population, or if you just have an intrepid band that goes off to colonize a new area, like we see in Finland, for example, and most of the individuals, like most of the individual population, have yellow and blue alleles, and one red allele comes along for the ride, that this population, as it expands, may, because of genetic drift, lose these red alleles and have that gone completely from the population. But the other can also happen, that you can go for a relatively rare allele in the founder population that because of genetic drift or even some sort of selective pressure, now you have a lot more of it. And this is the case that we see with severe combined immunodeficiency in the Navajo and the Jicarilla Apache due to the genocide that destroyed large numbers of their people. And an important point to make here is that we see this disease in the Navajo and Jicarilla Apache. We don't say we see it in American Indians, because there are lots of different, many different tribes in the Americas, and it was only these that happened to have this allele that increased in frequency. Now we need to be aware of it in this population so that we can screen for it and we can make sure that infants who are born with severe combined immunodeficiency get the hematopoietic stem cell transplant that they need to survive. So this brings us now to endogamy. This is just a lovely study from Nature Genetics looking at variation in South Asia. So the researchers identified 260 distinct groups And the groups were based on caste or geography or family ties or language. This map shows the different colors were referring to different linguistic groups. And when they did their genomic analysis, they found that 81 of these 260 groups showed a loss of genetic variation more extreme than what we see in the Finns and the Ashkenazi Jews, which are two groups that we typically associate with high rates of recessive genetic diseases. And in fact, there was one population they found that was particularly susceptible to a muscle relaxant that's used in anesthesia. And it was absolutely contraindicated in individuals of this ancestry. Now, using that data, we don't say, oh, this is something Indians shouldn't take because it's one population out of these 260. And we don't say, well, Asians shouldn't be given this medication because it's just one group out of all of Asia. So again, this comes down to the specificity of the population, not to use a heuristic of race, socially defined race. And then we have the issue of population admixture, which I've already alluded to. So this is a study looking at genetic ancestry using SNPs from 23andMe. And these are for individuals who self-identify as African American. And you can see that there's significant geographic variation of mean African ancestry versus mean European ancestry. So you can see here, looking at mean European ancestry in West Virginia, for example, we have more than 35% European ancestry, and very high here in Washington as well, with lower amounts, for example, in Florida and Georgia. And you can see here, by comparison, that we have a much higher African ancestry here in South Carolina. Now, when we talk about the variation in this socially defined group, this becomes very important because particularly if we're looking at a disease such as factor V Leiden, which is a hypercoagulable state. Typically, we associate greater coagulative activity in homozygotes, but heterozygotes as well can be hypercoagulable. And you may not recognize this if you look at an individual and think, that person's African American, don't account for population admixture and overlook the possibility that they may have European ancestry that confers or increases their risk of that particular allele. Now, when we look at individuals who come from Latin America, it's more complicated because we have a triad mixture of European, African, and Amerindian. And as you can see here, again, that there's significant geographic variation. And this is important because when you look at research studies, I'll refer to Hispanics. This is more common in Hispanics. What does that even mean? Because we can see here there's tremendous variation across that group. And this becomes particularly interesting when we look at the Latin American countries, because this could be part of our ethnicity. We could be talking about individuals from Mexico or individuals with Colombian ancestry. So in this study, they looked at genetic ancestry. And again, since this is Latin American populations, we have triad mixture. And you can see that European ranges from about 18% to 72%. And there are definitely differences across these different countries. So you may think, well, this could be valid. We could talk about different tumor types that arise in these different genetic backgrounds. But wait. Let's look more closely at Colombia, which you can see here typically has about 64% European ancestry, 29% Amerindian, and 7% Sub-Saharan or African. If we take a look, and this is a different study, at the country, here we have the country of Colombia. If we do look at the genomes of individuals from Medellin, which is an urban center in Colombia, we will see that their genetic ancestry mirrors what we see in the population as a whole. It's going to be largely European and some Native American and a small amount of African contribution. But at the neighboring state of Chocó, which was a site of plantation agriculture and had a history of bringing in enslaved individuals from Africa, we see something very, very different. We see a huge amount of African ancestry contributing here. And what's important to recognize is that do the people in Colombia think of themselves as, white or black or African descent, any of that, or are they Colombian? And what does that mean when they come to the United States? Because they're speaking Spanish, so they'll be called Hispanic, but they can be Hispanic black or Hispanic white, and it gets very convoluted. And I think it's important to recognize that the terms that are used also vary by country. So someone who has a particular identity in their home country, when they come to the United States, can find that identity shift. So we've just talked about the intrinsic causes of disparities, and I need to point out that a lot of time, money, and energy is just poured into research, trying to find differences, biologic differences based on socially defined race. It's amazing. But you need to pull back from that and recognize, and this is a statement from the New England Journal of Medicine, that, as I talked about before, variation is continuous and discordant with race. Systematic variation according to continent is very limited, and there is no evidence that the units of interest for medical genetics correspond to what we call races. So all of this money, time, and energy is, I believe, at some level being poured into supporting systemic racism. It is not about reducing disparities. So I encourage you to keep that in mind. So what is the big driver of health disparities? Because it's really not these genetic causes. It's the extrinsic causes. It's poverty, access to care, food access, neighborhood, stress, health insurance, and overlaid and permeating all of these are individual, institutional, and systemic racism. So let's talk briefly about this concept. I'm sure that you're all aware of this, but it's always good to get on the same page. Personal racism, of course, is individual acts that, with growing frequency, appear to also be part of institutional and cultural systemic acts. Institutional racism are the policies and practices of institutions like hospitals and universities that include and serve and protect white people, but not people of color. And an example of this would be when the first phenylketonuria testing clinic began. They only screened white children because black kids don't get PKU, which is not true. Cultural and systemic racism are the beliefs, values, and norms of a society that, again, uplift, protect, serve, financially resource white communities at the expense of communities of color. And the clearest example of this is that our society does not believe in universal health care. And you know that this has a tremendous impact on health disparities. So let's take a look at just how prevalent these disparities are. So there's been a lot in the media recently about pregnancy-related deaths based on socially defined race. You can see here that the rate in African American women is almost 3 times what we see in European American women, and we have American Indian and Alaska Native women falling in between. That for almost all malignancies, we see cancer death rates that are higher in African Americans compared to other socially defined races. The exception being cutaneous malignancies related to ultraviolet radiation, such as melanoma and squamous cell carcinoma, because of the protective effect of melanin. And then this is looking at a complex disease, hypertension. And you may think that this is an odd graphic. In the actual graphic in the paper, they used a different scale for blacks, because if you put blacks and whites on the same scale, blacks is entirely at the highest level. So clearly there are tremendous health disparities. So whenever I see a statement that refers to health disparities based on socially defined race, I turn to these social determinants of health. And we're going to do an exercise on that for a couple of slides, but I also want to pause and point out that 20 years ago, when we talked about social determinants of health, we thought of 3 things: income, education, and occupation. That told us what we needed about social determinants of health. Well, now we know that because of redlining, African American and Latin American populations in the United States were exposed and continue to be exposed to higher levels of toxins and greater particulate matter. There's increased exposure to lead. We are aware that there are so many different social determinants of health that we don't even know about yet. If you look at the proximity to a Superfund site, it's much higher in non-European populations. So whenever I see a paper and it says, even when we accounted for social determinants of health, race still was a contributing factor, I think, I wonder what you missed. I wonder what social determinant of health you're not aware of that they'll know about in 10, 15, or 20 years, because it really does come down to that. So in this particular study, I have a quote from Up to Date, which refers to these studies here. And what was found was that, as you're aware, there are two general categories of hysterectomy or surgical removal of the uterus. One is an open hysterectomy, which you have an abdominal incision. It takes a long time to heal from that. One can't lift heavy objects with that abdominal incision. And you can get a minimally invasive technique, so robot assist or laparoscopic or transvaginal hysterectomy. And what these studies showed was that women who were eligible for either type, so they were able physically to have either type, if they were Black, Hispanic, or publicly insured, they were less likely to receive the minimally invasive technique compared to white women, which meant they had that greater pain, that longer recovery time, they couldn't lift heavy objects, and we're talking about a population that perhaps when we look at publicly insured women, they don't have a lot of sick days they can take off. They may be marginally surviving, and then you add this to them. And I would say that the components here, and just keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list. I think this list should probably be 4 or 5 times as long. But systemic racism is definitely a component because of the link to public insurance. Institutional racism, because the hospitals that serve these populations had fewer surgeons who performed minimally invasive techniques. Poverty, education, access to care, health insurance, perhaps neighborhood. And then if we look at something such as hypertension, so this is a statement from the 10th edition of Robbins Basic Pathology, which has been changed in the revised edition, we would say that all of these factors contribute to the pathologic effects of hypertension in African Americans. There is no slavery gene. There's been some talk that there was a genetic or selective pressure for individuals who survived the Middle Passage to be able to retain salt and water, and this is what leads to hypertension. That is incorrect. It's all of these things that are creating this hypertension in African Americans. So I encourage you, whenever you see a disparity that is associated with socially defined race, that you question any biological assumption that is made and try to figure out what is really the cause. And that's what I've done in my disparities document that I share with my medical students. Just to finish up, as always, here are some questions. I hope we all know the answer to this question, and the rest of these can be useful, but here's the big one. So I hope you got that out of this talk, and thank you as always for your time and attention.